Hello, everybody, and welcome to my presentation on the development of the gastrointestinal tract. Thank you for coming. My name is Peter. You guys probably already know me in the class, of course, and we're going to be talking a little bit breakdown of how the GI tract forms. We're going to be going through a bit of the foregut, the midgut, the hindgut. We're going to start out with a little bit of background information about body folding, which will be reviewed to all of us in class there. But it will get us started off on the right foot. But shout out to Nerd Ninja on YouTube that helped me get a good breakdown of what I wanted these images to look like. So we're going to do a combination of some of it I'm going to try and draw for you here on OneNote. And then for some of it, while I'm explaining, we're going to go through on some pictures and diagrams that I have pulled up as well. And so let's get started. First and foremost, with a bit of that background information regarding the body folding that's occurring. As you all know, when we're at that before gastrulation phase, we have our ectoderm internally. We have our endoderm internally. I think I said ectoderm. Ectoderm externally, of course, up here. In the middle there, we have our neural tube that's beginning to form. We have the notochord sitting just on the more ventral side of that right there. And then we have our mesoderm, which is divided up into the paraxial mesoderm here in the middle. Ooh, let's not use pink. Let's use red. I like red better. And we'll be using the mesoderm a lot and talking about it. But we've got the paraxial mesoderm here in the middle. We have an intermediate mesoderm here on the sides. And then we spread out here in these two other mesodermal layers that we've already talked about, being the somatic mesoderm as well as the splanchnic mesoderm. Somatic being here on the more ectodermal side right here. Oh wait, did I say somatic or splanchnic? I always mix them up. Somatic. I don't want to get that wrong because these are really important. The reason I'm doing this body folding background is because the somatic and the splanchnic mesoderm will be the covering around the gut tube. They'll eventually develop that layer as well as the outer coating of what's called the peritoneal cavity. And so we will get to that information a bit more later on. But for now, just remember this somatic and splanchnic layers and their value and what we're about to talk about. And so, as I'm sure you guys all remember as well, we have our folding that occurs during gastrulation, and everything we have right here will start to twist and move downwards. This will all drop down this way. We have our yolk sac here on this back end, which will get pinched off at the end there. The amniotic cavity will come and start to wrap around this way, as well as these layers will come and move in. And you can probably see where that splanchnic mesoderm and somatic mesoderm come in handy, because this layer here keeps moving around the sides. And again, of course, we have that over here on this side as well, moving in to pinch off and form that outer coating of lateral splanchnic mesoderm that surrounds the term. And this forms a lot of different layers, such as the lamina propria, the submucosa, muscular walls, some vasculature and things in this area. And we'll get into some of that later. Right here, where we have this vitelline duct essentially forming between the yolk sac as this goes out towards the umbilicus, and you've got, we'll get in more into what's actually in that area a little later on with the gut tube and the midgut region and so forth. But a lot of you are already familiar with Meckel's diverticulum that can occur here in this area, where you have that vitelline duct not separating, and so you still have that connection when it's connected in the middle there. But this is just some of the background I want to focus on first and foremost, because we're going to be talking a lot about what's called mesentery. And so I'm going to give you guys, let's draw this out. And we're going to start again with our gut tube. Let's scroll down here in the middle. So we have our gut tube in the middle. After we have gastrulation forming and everything starts to wrap around, what occurs is you have that layer. Oh, again with the pink. Gotta stop doing that. Oh, I got rid of the green too. We'll put those back. So you have that splanchnic mesodermal layer that's surrounding the gut tube, and it's connected initially, and for some of it entirely, like over the course of your lifespan, to the dorsal wall of this abdominal cavity that's forming by what's called the dorsal mesentery. It's initially what suspends the entire gut tube in this region, and it wraps around like this, as you can probably tell. And then, of course, on the outside, we still have that ectodermal layer going on as well. And we've got the somatic and the splanchnic mesoderm. And then on both sides, we've got a mesentery. And if you haven't heard the term mesentery before, I wasn't as familiar with it until I started studying the development of the GI tract. But mesentery is the connecting line between a lot of organs and different areas. Within a mesentery, you can have quite a few things. Let's say we're connecting to the stomach in this instance. Um, on this side, we can have vasculature running through it. So you can have arteries in, you can have veins coming out. You can have lymphatic vessels. We'll make them this purple color going in and coming out. And then also really important, you can have neurons. You can have nervous tissue that go in and innervate whatever organ we're working with. And so mesentery is a connection that holds up different areas in this peritoneal cavity. Let me make sure I label that too. So this is the peritoneal cavity. They do hold up all these different mesenteries and all these different organs, and it's going to be important to know that. But they also supply lots and lots of stuff, and they have a lot of good connections and things that are important. And so, just again, this back portion is our dorsal mesentery. This front portion is our ventral mesentery, and of course, being an I guess they couldn't make it easy on us when they were naming these things. So the dorsal mesentery actually has a different name. It's referred to as the dorsal mesogastrium. And of course, the ventral one is also the ventral mesogastrium, the connection in the back there between those. And the reason I'm spending the time talking about this is because the organs I'm going to talk about over the course of our time together, they're going to include the liver, the spleen, the pancreas, the gallbladder. We're going to talk about the intestines, of course, the stomach. Um, there's going to be intraperitoneal organs and retroperitoneal organs. An organ that's considered intraperitoneal has to have this mesentery essentially attached to it. And so, for example, the transverse colon is always going to have that mesentery attached. So it's going to be the intraperitoneal. It's going to be an intraperitoneal organ, as it always has a mesentery to connect it to the body wall and essentially hangs in the peritoneal cavity there. Other organs, though, such as the head, body, and tail of the pancreas, the ascending and descending colon, parts of the duodenum are going to anchor themselves to the back of the dorsal body wall, that cavity there, and they are going to be what's referred to as retroperitoneal, and they're going to be called secondary retroperitoneal. So anything that initially forms back here in the mesodermal layer, kind of not having that mesentery connection, is going to be retroperitoneal. Anything that forms in here in the gut tube and stays in the gut tube is going to be intraperitoneal. And anything that forms in the gut tube and moves to the dorsal body wall is going to be secondarily retroperitoneal. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we're going forward. There's going to be some things we talk about that that will be really, really important to know. And what connects it then once it becomes secondarily retroperitoneal is called adventitia, if you're ever curious about that. It's just a special form of connective tissue that kind of cements it to that back part of the wall there. Okay, now let's get into the breakdown. And actually, before we do that, let me show you an image real quick of what I am talking about. Oh, I don't think I have that one. My apologies. We'll hop back to the notes there, and I'll start drawing out the sections we're going to talk about. So we're going to be going into the three main regions of the primitive gut, which you guys we've already heard about and talked about in class, but we have the foregut, the midgut, and the hindgut. And so conventionally, these guys have you've been designated an organ in the foregut if you're innervated by not innervated, if you receive your vasculature from the celiac artery, for example. But that is kind of no longer as true as it used to be. When I was going through the book and looking up online, I'll write out what designated an organ to be part of the foregut. It was what arteries connected to it. So we had the celiac trunk for the foregut. We had the superior mesenteric artery for the midgut, and you might guess it, but the inferior mesenteric artery right there for our hindgut. And so that's what they conventionally have been named by. But that vasculature doesn't actually form before some of the organs here differentiate. So the actual formation of these different areas is by gene expression, which forms the boundaries between the more cranial endoderm or the more caudal endoderm that we're working with. Some that I wrote down. So, for example, in the cranial endoderm, you'll have greater expression of LHX1, OTX1, HESX1, and SERL, while in the caudal endoderm, you'll have higher expression of CDX and things like that. And so gene expression really is the primary factor in the formation and differentiation of these different parts of the body. And we're going to spend most of our time talking today about the foregut, just because it is the most interesting of them all. And it's what stuck out to me the most. And I get to pick because you guys are listening to me right now. But the other ones we'll touch on as well, and we'll describe a bit about what's going on in their areas also. And the foregut, we're going to divide into 3 or 4 different areas, kind of. We're going to start off by talking about the stomach. And we're going to do a little drawing for it, and then I'll show you that image. But I want to see if you can stay with me as I discuss it a little bit here. So first and foremost, around day 26, the thoracic foregut, so the foregut that's up here in the top, the endodermal layer, the gut tube, here at the very top section. Oh, well, I should mention as well, forgot to do this just a second ago, the foregut contains the organs that begin in about the pharynx, the larynx, in that mouth region, and it extends down to about the first half of the duodenum. So for those of you that know your, I guess, GI tract anatomy, you'll have that pharynx, your larynx, your esophagus, down into your stomach, and then you connect to your small intestines, which is the first part of which is that first half of your duodenum. And then the midgut extends from that second half of the duodenum all the way down to the first 2/3 of the transverse colon. And the colon is your large intestine. You go through that small intestine, you'll have the duodenum, jejunum, and your ileum. Then you'll pop into the cecum there at the very bottom of your descending colon. And then you've got the transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon, and then your rectum and your anus. And so that's what included in the hindgut, is that back third, the distal portion of the transverse colon, as well all the way down to the upper rectum. The actual anus isn't actually a part of the hindgut itself, but just wanted to give you that little background for these different areas, what designates what portion we're at when we're going through it. So that's why we're starting with the stomach right here. This section is to describe its formation, it's what's happening, because we have this tube that we were looking at up here. If we do it and we look at it on like a more of a sagittal or coronal view for our stomach, it's initially around day 26 going to have that expansion of the thoracic foregut, like I mentioned. 2 days later, you're going to start to see that fusiform shape occurring, where you're going to have some expansion, some bulbing, kind of like a spindle is what they describe it, to get the formation of the stomach around that endodermal gut tube layer that's occurring there. Around just a little bit later, about week 5, the dorsal wall, so the wall farthest from the front of the embryo, which would be this side on the image I've drawn right now, begins to grow faster than the ventral side. And again, for those of you that know a little bit about intestinal anatomy, or I mean GI tract anatomy, not intestinal, you'll know where this is going. That dorsal side begins to grow faster because we're going to be forming the greater curvature of the stomach. So let's redraw this again real quick. What begins to happen is we get this bulging, that not like that, that's really bad bulge, I'm sorry, bigger bulging that's occurring. And the same thing happens on the ventral side of it as well, just not as quickly as what happens on the dorsal portion of that, those cells that are differentiating, which is why we have the greater and the lesser curvature created. About week 7 to week 8, after this has developed a bit more, and it starts to look more like this kind of. After it's developing more, of week 7 to 8, we get what's a 90-degree rotation. So if we go back up to this guy right here, this mesentery is extended dorsally and ventrally. But what occurs is essentially you get this twisting in the abdominal wall cavity, that peritoneal space that we've been talking about. that causes that greater curvature to be shifted over to the left side of the body, and that lesser curvature to get focused a bit more to the right. Well, it just is facing the right in that way. But it is more medial than the greater curvature is. And we also have a bit of a ventrodorsal rotation, which is kind of just like a top down occurring because it twists a little bit. And when the greater curvature is slightly oriented caudally, and the lesser curvature is slightly oriented cranially. Sounds kind of funky. I don't know why cranially sounds weird in my mind. But that rotation as well, if you remember, like I talked about before, down here just below the stomach, we have the duodenum. Maybe I should have drawn that in a different color so you can see it. We'll just outline it for now in a nice blue. But right here, below the stomach, we have that duodenum that's going to be forming. And remember, the first half of that duodenum is part of the foregut that we're talking about here first. And when we have that stomach rotating 90 degrees, that dorsal mesentery getting kicked over to the side there, and we'll get back to that later, especially when we're talking about the spleen, but the duodenum there and that portion gets pushed over to the right. It causes, with that rotation to the left, the duodenum gets pushed over to the right, and it creates kind of a C shape that occurs. It gets that kind of chunk right there. And when you have that, the duodenum then, after a little bit, and I'll talk about this when we talk more about what forms from the duodenum just next with the liver, the gallbladder, and pancreas. But the duodenum is then going to adhere to the dorsal body wall. So I don't know if you guys remember, but when we were talking about before all those differences between retroperitoneal and intraperitoneal organs, the duodenum goes from being intraperitoneal, fully extended by mesentery in the cavity, to being a secondarily retroperitoneal organ as it adheres to the dorsal body wall. That adherence that occurs creates what's called the lesser sac of the peritoneal cavity. And so you now have your stomach oriented on the left, duodenum fused there on the right. Behind the stomach, you're going to have the formation of this sac of the peritoneal cavity. Let's see if we can get a look at it here, where we look at the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. Not too much, but know that this right here with our duodenum that's forming in the stomach here, that's where that forms. And you have what occurs with that mesentery that's behind the stomach and the duodenum. You get a formation of what's called the greater omentum, which, for those of you that have ever done a dissection of a human, or maybe other things as well, the greater omentum is just everywhere. Once you open up someone's abdominal cavity, it is this covering that drops down and covers all those inferior organs beneath the stomach in there, and it has a lot of fat in it. It has a lot of vasculature at this point, at least. But you have that greater omentum forming, and the lesser omentum we won't talk about very much, but it actually forms in a connection between the stomach and the liver on this lesser curvature, hence why the name comes from. The greater omentum occurs on that greater curvature on the dorsal side of the stomach next to duodenum, dropping down, covering that. So if we were to draw that, greater omentum would kind of come down this way and cover up those intestines that are going to be forming, and the lesser omentum kind of heads out this way towards the liver in that way, and kind of creates a sheet that way. But for the most part, that's how we get the formation of the stomach, with that 90-degree rotation pushed in the back. And it has a few mesenteries sticking out the side of it, maintaining it hanging in the peritoneal cavity kind of thing. But anyway, let's scooch on. In the foregut, next up on our docket, we're going to talk about the formation of the liver. And let's do, what would be a good one? We'll go orange for the liver. I like orange. I'm a Broncos fan. So what I'm drawing there, about day 22, we have an endodermal thickening that occurs in the duodenum on the ventral side of the duodenum. So that ventral side, again, initially is oriented in that just straight forearm direction. But just remember, the liver is going to get kicked around to the right side when that rotation is occurring. So we have a thickening around day 22 on the ventral side of the duodenum that forms the hepatic plate. And then we get this kind of diverticulization. Don't know if that's a word, just made it up, but we're going to say it is. In other words, budding or ballooning that occurs as this hepatic plate, this thickening right there in the duodenum, kind of balloons outward a little bit, and we get what's called the hepatic diverticulum. And it can give rise to a couple of things. It can form hepatoblasts as it continues to expand and bulge outwards, or it can also form mesenchymal cells that can actually help give rise up here on the top to the septum transversum, in the inferior portion of it, because you got that diaphragm folding down right above here. And there's actually a lot of interaction that occurs that we're not going to have time to get into between the liver and the septum transversum. But just know that some of those cells from the hepatic diverticulum actually contribute to the septum transversum as well. But for our purposes, the hepatoblasts, under the direction of Notch signaling that gets activated in the region, can differentiate into a lot of cells here in that liver region. We can get hepatocytes, which are what actually form the liver itself, and they're influenced by Notch signaling, as well as influences from the septum transversum, as well as cardiogenic mesoderm signals that are in the area at the time. It'll form Hepatoblasts will also form the bile caniculi. It'll also form hepatic ducts, and lots of different things that form our liver. And early on, this liver that we're forming is actually mostly functioning as a hematopoietic organ. And if any of you don't remember, hematopoiesis is the formation of blood cells, and cells throughout the body. And so its original purpose is to generate those cells and be a house for those cells. But eventually, as peripheral organs begin to take on that function more and more later on, we're going to see the upregulation of the actual function of the liver, namely detoxification, formation and creation of bile, and a breakdown of amino acids and things like that. And then, so that's basically what happens with the liver. It's part connected on that ventral mesentery that gets rotated over and pushed over, which is why it occurs more on that right side, and it proliferates a lot, and it grows very, very rapidly in a lot of instances. It kind of takes up a lot of space there, and there's a future research I'll talk about at the end a bit. But on day 26, a few days after the original formation of that hepatic plate, we have another ventral duodenum thickening occurring, and we'll do this one in, we'll just do it in white right here below it. This other thickening that's going on is the cystic diverticulum that's forming. So we have the plate that originally forms and thickens, and then it forms a cystic diverticulum, which gives rise to our gallbladder and the cystic duct here at the bottom that connects it originally to that endodermal gut tube lining. Cells that are in that area between the cystic and the hepatic ducts right there, they will fuse and end up forming the common bile duct. And so essentially what occurs, I erased half of our stomach too. We'll put that back. And just as a reminder, this is the duodenal portion, but they'll end up fusing. And so we'll get this cystic duct here connected to the hepatic duct, which is going off into our liver formation over there, kind of like this. And where they connect this area right here is the common bile duct that's forming as those two diverticula bulge, and then they fuse, and then they continue to grow. And by the growth of this common bile duct, it ends up pushing the gallbladder and the liver farther up and away from the gut tube. So they kind of begin to proliferate and diverge out of that area. And that's most of what I want to talk about for the spleen and the liver and how they're formed in the GI tract. Moving on to the pancreas, it kind of forms in two parts, which is really cool. And it rotates around. I really loved how this one works, because it's also, we're staying here in the duodenum. We're still in this area, but we have a ventral and a dorsal part to our pancreas. So we'll use this pink. We'll give pink a chance now because I kept using it accidentally before. And so, similar to what we had going on with the liver and our gallbladder, we're going to have a thickening occurring around day 26 of the dorsal and the ventral areas in the duodenum there. So the dorsal portion here is going to give rise later to the head, the body, and the tail of our pancreas. The ventral portion is going to form what's called the uncinate process, I think is how it's called. I don't know exactly. I mostly just read these things in the textbook and then try and say them out loud, and it doesn't always go great. But anyway, what they do is they begin to bud outwards, and it differs a little bit from a usual epithelium folding or expansion process that you'd see. So the budding of the pancreas is Well, we'll do a usual epithelium. For usual epithelium, it's just a line of cells, and then you'll see a little bulge, and then it will progress into like, those kind of lumen that form and the branching that goes on out of it. For our pancreas, though, what actually happens with its budding is you get this buildup of what I think they call epithelial clusters, and so you'll just have tons and tons of cells just bunched up in a mass, right, like this on the lining of what we're working with. And essentially what they'll do is they'll all just line up and spread out. I don't know a better way to phrase it, but the clusters lead to what's called intraepithelial membranes that coalesce and to form these lumens. And so you'll go from this into the same end product you'd see at the other spot, where you'd get those branches occurring and different lumen forming and different ducts occurring in the pancreas. But it does so by coalescing and then spreading out rather than just forming it as the epithelium differentiates and grows. And from this budding, you get the formation of lots of cool cells. So you have exocrine cells, which form the digestive enzymes that get secreted here into the duodenum. You've got the, what are they called? The ductal cells, the pancreatic ductal cells, and their purpose is to allow those digestive enzymes to migrate without kind of digesting the pancreas itself, and to hop out into the duodenum and into the GI tract. And then lastly, you have those exocrine cells as well that shoot off lots of hormone signaling in the form of insulin, glucagon, somatostatin, to regulate blood sugar and blood pressure in the body. And so the pancreas is really cool, getting to act as both endocrine and exocrine glands simultaneously. But anyway, back to the formation that we had going on here. You're going to get this budding occurring. Oh, I just erased my stomach again. I'm not going to draw the duodenum. You guys know it's there again. But we've got this budding that starts to occur again off the sides. We get two different formings of the pancreas. And then what happens is the ventral side with the bile duct here is going to have a 90-degree or a 180-degree rotation basically around the back side to fuse with the other pancreatic duct that's there on the other side. So this one is a little bit larger, as I mentioned, because it has the head, the body, and the tail. And this one pops around. We'll just leave him gone for now. I keep erasing the stomach. Forms the main process here, and then a little bud off the side. And this is that uncinate process that I was talking about before. And then inside of it, we've got all those kind of leafing that's occurring that I was describing with those epithelial cells that are branching off. And originally, they both have a duct into the GI tract there. But by the fusing of the two pancreatic buds, the original bud for the dorsal portion right here ends up kind of obliterating and disappearing, and it fuses with the ventral bud that has combined with it, and that actually becomes the entrance into the GI tract. And this same connection that we had going on originally for the common bile duct also comes around the back. You still have the gallbladder there, also comes around the back, connects in, and they all dump out here together. Again, for those people that know their anatomy, it's through the ampulla of Vader is the connection that allows it to expel through there. For those of you that's seen Star Wars, of course, Vader in German means father, and so it kind of ruins the second movie. But anyway, that's the main formation of the pancreas, your liver, your gallbladder. We're going to move on and talk a little bit about the spleen, which is a little different than what we talked about before. These guys all derive from the endodermal lining. The spleen, however, if we go back, derives from this mesodermal layer that we have with the dorsal mesentery. It actually derives from this area here in the dorsal mesentery, and these cells begin to coalesce in the dorsal mesogastrium, as we called it before, of the lesser sac. And that lesser sac, like I mentioned, is behind here where the stomach and after the stomach and the duodenum, the duodenum is fused. That's where the lesser sac forms, and that's where the spleen is going to be forming. And for this one, we'll go back to this image, which is showcasing better than I drew what I just talked about for the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder again. But behind it, actually, we'll go to the other one for the spleen. Yes, okay. Here's that top-down view. Here we have that dorsal mesogastrium with the connection on. We got our stomach forming here in the middle, and that connection on the ventral side to the liver that's forming here in the front. And then we have our spleen here in the back, which is really cool. Essentially, on the fourth week, um, mesenchymal cells that are in this dorsal mesentery, aka the mesogastrium, begin to coalesce. And around the 5th week, after they've coalesced, they begin to differentiate into splenic cells. And you can also have these other cool little things called accessory spleens forming, which may not be cool if they aren't absorbed or obliterated, but little microspleens that can form around the area as well. The spleen, as I mentioned, is mesodermal derived. And as the stomach rotates and the dorsal mesoderm, not dorsal mesoderm, dorsal mesentery grows, as you can see it expanding and moving, it'll also push the spleen over to the left side of the body in that cavity over there. And initially, like the liver as well, the spleen functions as a hematopoietic organ, but it's that's only for the preliminary stage. From about weeks 0 to week 14 is when the spleen functions, creating those cells, and then it kicks over into its primary function as a lymphoid organ. From week 15 to 18, it's in this transition stage. At week 18, you have T cells that start to migrate in, and then about week 23 is when B cells come in. And for those of you that have taken a little bit of immunology, you probably know that B cells and T cells are necessary for the adaptive immune response. They're really what allow you to have a strong immune response to a pathogen after your initial exposure to it. So the spleen is a wonderful, wonderful lymphoid organ at combating infection and things like that. And it originally does not function in that capacity, which is a little different than what we're used to. And that's the majority of what we talked about, going back to our presentation notes for the foregut that we're going to talk about: the spleen, the stomach, the pancreas, gallbladder, the liver. We're going to move on and talk a little bit about the midgut. So let's move down. As we mentioned, it has received its vasculature through the superior mesenteric artery. That's its blood supply. And what happens once we have the endodermal gut tube forming is the area that's going to form the future ileum, the future cecum, and ascending colon. And we think we talked about this a little bit in class, but we'll draw it again in green. Begins to form this loop, like so. Maybe that's kind of cecum-y. And then right in the middle of this loop that's forming, we have that superior mesenteric artery that has these branches, of course, and is supplying the vasculature, as I mentioned. This loop forms at the differentiation point. So if this right here with a little bump is supposed to be our cecum, up here on the cranial portion, we would have the future ileum, and on the caudal portion, we'll have our future ascending colon and portions of the transverse colon and things like that. The superior mesenteric artery that runs down the middle of the loop, and then by week 6, elongation of this loop as it continues to differentiate and expand causes a herniation into the umbilicus. So like we talked about before, in this diagram, we have this vital duct that's extending into the gut. This is a little different. What we've got going on down here is just the expansion of it into that area. And while it's expanding, okay, this is an important thing to notice. While it's expanding into it at week 6 to week 8, it takes about 2 weeks, but we have a 90-degree rotation occurring in the counterclockwise direction if you're looking at it from a front-on view. And so this cranial portion will be moved over to the right side of the embryo, and the caudal portion will be moved up to the left side of the embryo. So we'll draw that a little bit. Just a 90-degree counterclockwise rotation. And this will be important to position the different parts of our midgut into our abdominal cavity. It takes 2 weeks, like I mentioned. During that time period, while the rotation is occurring, while it's herniating into the umbilicus, you have jejunal ileal loops forming here in the intestinal cavity back this way. We've got continued expansion of the intestine and loops forming with the jejunum and the ileum. And then you also have the variform appendix that forms off the bottom of the cecum during that 2-week time period. By week 10, though, only 2 weeks after it's stuck in and rotated, it begins to retract. And the exact mechanism for why it starts to retract and pull out again from that herniated loop is not entirely known. They've got some theories, and I'll talk about that at the end when I talk about research. But while it's retracting, we have another rotation going on, and it rotates 180 degrees, meaning that our total rotation, it does it in the same direction, counterclockwise. Our total rotation now is 270 degrees from our original position. That rotation kind of positions the cecum up towards where the liver is at, and we'll have continued expansion and growth that kind of ends up pushing it down to the bottom of the peritoneal cavity there on the right side. But it's completely returned by the week 11. So week 10, we start to retract. Week 11, it's already out. So it pulls out pretty quick. And then after return, we have the ascending colon. If we draw it over here, transverse, and then descending. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier on, the transverse colon maintains its intraperitoneal designation, but the ascending colon and descending colon actually will fuse to the dorsal body wall through that adventitia I mentioned, and they become secondarily retroperitoneal again, like I also have talked about a bit beforehand. And so that's the big portion of the midgut, where you have that second half of the duodenum through that first part of the transverse colon. And we talked a little bit about the hindgut as well, with that descending colon solidifying to the back of the wall as it was after it differentiated and things like that. But this is the main formation of the midgut, is that expansion, that herniation, that retraction, and then that solidification, essentially. You've got formation of loops going on throughout. If this retraction does not occur at week 10, that's where you have the omphalocele that we talked about in class occur, where it's herniated from the abdominal cavity, but it has that covering. It's still maintained, not like gastrochysis, if that's how you say it, which actually occurs when this fusing does not occur properly, and you have it exposed there at week 3, week 4, where you have gastrulation occurring. I mean, not gastrulation, body folding occurring. Anyway, moving on to the hindgut, because I'm taking too much time. Right at the back of our booty area, we have this come down. We go down through the sigmoid colon, as that S shape. If we connect it up to where we were before, sigmoid colon then connects there into our descending colon. But here down by the rectum, we have our cloacal membrane, where we have the oropharyngeal membrane on the other side with the mouth. And then we have the allantois off here that then connects up to the vital line duct. And it's originally sealed there at the bottom. And this area just in front of that sealing area, where the allantois kicks up and the rectum ends, is called the cloaca. Originally, these two areas right here are connected, but quickly you'll see that with between weeks 4 and 6, not too far after that folding is finished, you'll have the formation of the anorectal canal right here, and the formation of a urogenital canal occurring over here. I think they actually call it urogenital septum. And this happens because right here we have pushing down of what's called the urorectal septum. And it comes in, it kind of separates those two areas where the allantois is and where the ending of the endoderm is at, and it pinches them off. Right before it gets to the end there, though, actually the cloacal membrane pops open and it is exposed to the exterior. You'll notice that this urogenital septum, will become the future bladder, the future urethra, also the phallic segment for men and women. And then the anorectal formation, we actually have some invasion here that occurs from ectodermal cells that come back in, and they plug it up. Not too long after it opens up, they'll come in and form an anal membrane, is what it's called, that obliterates the vestibule at the distal end of the endodermal layer there. And it breaks down by week 8, but the bottom 1/3 of that portion right there is lined with ectodermal cells actually in the internal portion there. And then the back 2/3 of the rectum is endodermal lined. And so you kind of have this separation occurring, this opening occurring in the hindgut, and then this expansion formation of the allantois as you get the formation of the bladder and the connection to the kidneys with the ureters, and some really, really cool things going on. I'm sorry I don't have more time to talk about it. But just to finish up, some other research I wanted to mention, some really cool things that they're doing currently is they've been looking at asymmetry with that rotation that occurs. So they've been looking at the asymmetric rotation of the intestine, and they know that that caused by outside forces acting on the intestine, causing that rotation. Um, but they weren't sure what was going on with the stomach. The greater and lesser curvature asymmetry was a little bit more confusing. So did a study and they found out 2 years ago that the curvature that occurs in the stomach is due to intrinsic forces in the gut tube itself by the influence of transcription factors, namely FOXJ1, nodal, and PITX2, that cause the factors, the increase in the greater curvature of the stomach and the smaller side, lesser curvature of the stomach, and that asymmetry. So that was new. They'd never really seen something that was kind of innately internal and not caused by a mechanical force or an influence from like the mesoderm or something outside of it. And so that was kind of cool to see an internal portion of the gut tube causing that in the stomach. And then future research, they're really also looking at that internal rotation because they hypothesize that the regression of the because the mechanism for it to come back in is still not known. They believe that that regression to bring it back inside is due to the regression of the mesenteric kidneys, the reduced liver growth, or potentially abdominal cavity expansion in some way, causing it to return inside. So they've been trying to do research for the future to find out why is that coming back in, and that can be very helpful to study varicoceles as well as intestinal malrotation, which occurs when you have incorrect placing of the intestines inside. It can be detrimental. But so that's some really cool research they're doing right now and looking to do in the future. But yeah, that's most of what I had. I hope I haven't gone over time for the midgut, the hindgut, and the foregut. But thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it.